5 years later, I confronted the reality of my actions, facing my husband after he discovered my infidelity with my boss. 5 agonizing years had elapsed since my world crumbled. 5 years since Ethan, my husband, the man I once considered my soulmate, caught me in the embrace of another, Michael, my boss. The betrayal was monumental, shattering not only Ethan's trust, but also the life we had meticulously constructed over a decade. The memory of that night played relentlessly in my mind. Ethan's stunned silence, his trembling hands gripping the takeout bag he'd brought, the way the light seemed to drain from his eyes as he witnessed Michael and me in that compromising situation. He didn't yell, didn't rage. He simply stood there, observing me as if I were a complete stranger before turning and walking away. Divorce was unavoidable. Ethan refused any communication throughout the proceedings, and I couldn't fault him. Tears streamed down my face as I signed the papers, understanding I had forfeited any right to contest anything. Our house, our shared memories, him. When it was finalized, I left town, incapable of bearing the weight of my mistakes and the whispers of our shared acquaintances. I spent the subsequent years striving to reconstruct my life. Therapy became my refuge, a place where I dissected the fractures in my marriage and the darker facets of myself that had led to the affair. It wasn't solely about the act of cheating. It was about the loneliness, the crippling fear of inadequacy, and the desperate craving for validation that I sought from Michael. I had sabotaged the most precious thing in my life, and no amount of introspection could alter that. Guilt gnawed at me daily. But the most agonizing part wasn't the infidelity itself, but the realization that Ethan had always loved me with a depth I hadn't fully appreciated. He was patient, kind, and supportive, consistently present whenever I needed him. He had been my confidant, my rock, yet I betrayed him. I betrayed everything we had built, everything we had fought for together. Michael had been a fleeting escape, a brief flicker of validation in an otherwise desolate space, but it cost me the love of my life. When Sarah, one of Ethan's close friends who had always treated me kindly, sent me a wedding invitation, I almost didn't open it. Seeing her name evoked a torrent of memories, dinners, vacations, shared laughter. It felt like a lifetime ago. Hesitantly, I opened the envelope. My stomach dropped when I saw the location. The wedding was to be held in the same church where Ethan and I had exchanged our vows. Part of me wanted to rip the invitation to shreds and bury it in the trash. Another part, the part that still yearned for closure, felt an inexplicable compulsion to attend. I had never truly had the opportunity to say goodbye to Ethan, to offer a genuine apology. This was my chance. The thought of attending the wedding was both terrifying and alluring. I was still haunted by the memories of our time together, and I knew this could either be a step towards healing or another agonizing reminder of my failures. Against my better judgment, the day of the wedding arrived. I felt like a specter wandering through memories. The church appeared almost identical to how it had looked on my wedding day. The same stained glass windows, the soft glow of candles, the familiar scent of aged wood and roses. Every corner seemed to echo with fragments of my past with Ethan. Nervously, I scanned the crowd, both hoping and dreading to see him. And then I did. He was seated near the front, effortlessly handsome in a dark suit. His hair had a touch more gray, but his posture remained as confident as ever. He was conversing with a woman with vibrant red hair who laughed at something he said, her hand briefly brushing his arm. A knot of jealousy and regret twisted in my stomach. The woman with him was beautiful, graceful, confident. Everything I wasn't in that moment. A wave of bitterness and self-loathing washed over me. Was she the one who had taken my place in his heart? Did she bring him a happiness I had failed to provide? I tried to slip into a pew unnoticed, but my movement caught Ethan's eye. Our gazes locked, and time seemed to stop. His expression was unreadable. No anger, no warmth, just quiet acknowledgement. I wanted to speak, to apologize, but the words caught in my throat. I didn't deserve his forgiveness, not after everything I had done. So I remained silent, lowering my head and focusing on the ceremony. After the vows were exchanged and the reception began, I lingered near the exit, debating whether to leave before it became too overwhelming. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. "Clara?" Ethan's voice called softly behind me. I froze, my heart pounding as I turned to face him. There he stood, just a few feet away, looking so much like the man I had once loved. The pain in my chest was almost unbearable. "Ethan," I managed to say, my voice trembling, betraying the storm of emotions raging within me. Up close, Ethan was even more striking than I remembered. There was an air of maturity about him, a calmness I envied. He wasn't the same man I had left behind. There was something stronger in him now, something quieter. He had endured and moved forward while I had been trapped in my own regret. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said, his tone polite but distant, as if we were strangers, not two people who had shared years of love and trust. "Neither did I admitted. "I wasn't sure if it was a good idea to come, to be honest." "I see." Ethan nodded, his gaze steady but unreadable. "So, you're well?" I swallowed hard, struggling to maintain my composure. "I'm doing better, I guess. Therapy's helped. I'm trying to make sense of everything." The words felt hollow, like a poor substitute for the apology I didn't know how to give. "I'm glad to hear that," he said, his voice calm but distant. There was no trace of the anger or hurt that had consumed him years ago when he caught me with Michael. I couldn't tell if that meant he had forgiven me or if he simply didn't care anymore. "I'm so sorry, Ethan," I whispered, feeling the weight of years of regret bearing down on me. "For everything. I was selfish and I destroyed us. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed you to know how sorry I am. I ruined the best thing I ever had." Ethan studied me for a long moment, his expression softening just a little. "I don't know if I'll ever forgive you, Clara, but I've come to terms with what happened. I had to. It took time, a lot of time. I won't lie and say it didn't hurt like hell, but it's in the past now. I've moved on." His eyes flickered toward the woman with the red hair, who was now chatting with someone near the dance floor. I found peace. A pang of jealousy stirred within me, but I quickly suppressed it. I had no right to feel that way anymore. "I never stopped loving you," I said quietly. I wasn't the person you deserved." Ethan's eyes softened, and for a fleeting moment, I saw a glimpse of the man I once knew. But then it faded, replaced by something else, something I couldn't name but recognized as closure. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Clara," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You deserve that, but it won't be with me." I nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. He was right. I had lost him, and no amount of regret could change that. As I stood there facing the man I once loved, I realized something important. I couldn't undo the past. I couldn't fix the mistakes I had made or bring back the love we had lost. But I could learn from it. I could be a better person, one who no longer sought validation from others, one who could stand on her own 2 feet and move forward without the shadow of guilt hanging over her. And with that, I turned and walked away, leaving the past behind. It was time to start over. He nodded slowly. "It's been a long time." "It has," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. The years had passed, but it felt like no time at all. We stood there in the dim light, two people who once shared everything, now facing each other as strangers, with memories hanging between us. There was an awkward pause, the weight of our shared history hanging between us like a heavy curtain, its presence undeniable, suffocating almost. I wasn't sure what to say or how to begin. The years had transformed us into different people, yet the past clung to us like a shadow, neither of us able to fully escape it. "Do you want to talk?" he finally asked, surprising me with the gentleness in his voice. It was a question I hadn't anticipated, one I wasn't sure I was ready to answer. "Yeah," I said, my voice trembling as I fought to keep the tears at bay. I had longed for this moment in some twisted way, but now that it was here, I felt an overwhelming sense of vulnerability. I couldn't hide. We stepped outside, away from the noise and laughter of the reception. The evening air was cool, and I wrapped my arms around myself, hoping to find some sense of comfort. We stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of the party muffled behind us. It felt like we were standing at the edge of something deep, something painful. Neither of us seemed willing to be the first to speak. "I heard you left town," Ethan began, his voice breaking the silence like a soft ripple in still water. "I did," I said, taking a deep breath, the chill of the evening air making my skin tingle. I couldn't stay. Everything reminded me of what I'd done. It was like living in a house full of ghosts, each one more painful than the last. Ethan's eyes softened, but his expression remained unreadable. "And Michael?" he asked, his voice steady, as if bracing for whatever I might say. "It ended shortly after everything," I confessed, the words feeling heavy as they left my lips. I hated the weight of the truth, but I knew I had to say it. It was never real, Ethan. It was a mistake. A horrible, selfish mistake. I thought it would fill the emptiness I felt, but it only made everything worse. His jaw tightened, and I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Anger, hurt, or perhaps both. For a moment I thought he might walk away, that he couldn't bear to hear it. But instead, he spoke again, his voice low, as if the words were difficult for him to say. "I spent years trying to figure out what I did wrong," he said. "I kept asking myself if I wasn't enough for you, if there was something I could have done differently. I thought maybe I was the one who failed." Tears welled up in my eyes at the sound of his words, and I had to fight to keep them from spilling over. "It wasn't you, Ethan," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "It was me. I was scared, insecure, and I let my own fears ruin everything. You were more than enough. I was just too blind to see it." He looked at me for a long moment, his gaze intense, filled with a mix of sadness and something else I couldn't quite place. Acceptance, perhaps. It was hard to read him now, but I could tell he had moved on. And for a moment, I wondered if I could ever truly do the same. "I've moved on, Clara," he said finally, breaking the silence. His words were calm, but I could hear the finality in them. It wasn't easy, but I had to. You can't live in the past forever. I nodded, my chest aching at his words. I had always known he would move on, but hearing him say it aloud felt like a gut punch. Still, I managed to force a small smile. "I'm glad," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You deserve to be happy, Ethan. You always did." He hesitated for a moment before speaking again, his tone softening. "And you?" he asked, his eyes searching mine. "Have you found peace?" The question hit me harder than I expected. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to tell him that everything was fine, that I had everything figured out. But the truth was far from that. "I'm trying," I admitted, my voice cracking. "I've spent the last 5 years trying to understand myself, trying to forgive myself. It's a work in progress. I don't know if I'll ever completely find peace, but I'm learning to accept that maybe that's okay." We stood there in silence for a long while, the world around us fading into the background. I could hear the faint sound of music drifting through the open windows of the reception hall, but it felt so distant now. The only thing that mattered was the weight of this conversation between us, the fragile thread of connection that seemed to stretch, but not quite break. "I'm glad we talked," Ethan said finally, his voice low and sincere. "I think I needed this more than I realized." "Me too," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. It was as if a heavy burden had been lifted, but I knew it wasn't over yet. "I'm so sorry for everything, Ethan. I hope you know that. I hope you know how much I regret the way things ended." "I do," he said, giving me a small, knowing smile. There was no bitterness in his voice, no anger, just a quiet understanding that both of us had been shaped by the past. but that we didn't have to let it define us anymore. "I hope you find happiness, Clara," he said, his voice soft but firm. "You deserve it. We both do." I felt a lump form in my throat at his words, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I could speak. But somehow, I managed to say what I needed to. "Thank you," I whispered. "I hope you find everything you've been searching for, too." He gave me one last look, a mixture of fondness and something else, acceptance maybe, before turning to walk back toward the reception. I watched him go, feeling a strange sense of closure that I hadn't expected. It was like a door closing, but not in the way I had imagined for so long. I had carried the weight of guilt and regret, convinced that I had ruined everything beyond repair. But in that moment, standing in the cool night air, I realized that forgiveness, both his and my own, was the first step toward healing. I had lost Ethan because of my own mistakes, but now I understood that healing didn't mean going back. It meant moving forward. As I stood there, watching him disappear into the warmth of the reception hall, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, I could start moving forward too. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe that I could still find a path to happiness. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more amazing stories.